So it's my particular honor to introduce a colleague and friend of mine, Dr. Merrill Rotter, and that Merrill is senior advisor, forensic advisor to the New York State Office of Mental Health. He also is the director of the Division of Law and Psychiatry program at the Department of Psychiatry at Albert Einstein in New York. He also serves in the Brock Psychiatric Center as medical director of the EAC program. Merrill has a wide range of clinical and policy experiences, is one of our field's leading voices in the area of responding to individuals with serious mental illness in the criminal justice system. And we've asked Merrill to expand on some of the concepts that you've heard over the past day and a half as it relates to risk, need, and responsivity by helping us unpack the responsivity component of that paradigm, particularly as it relates to individuals with serious mental illness. So if you would join me in welcoming Dr. Rotter, we'll look forward to the following presentation.
Thank you, Fred. Hopefully you'll bear with me. This is something that actually Fred and I, among others, have been talking about and thinking about for the better part of a couple of years now. And this is sort of my first chance to kind of put it out for an audience of people like yourselves. And so I look forward to hopefully feedback when I'm done. Hopefully we'll have some time for some responses to the kinds of things we're talking about. About through here. I didn't know I was on the screen. Okay, hi. So basically, I'm going to talk a little bit about, very quickly, kind of run through stuff that you've heard about for the past couple of days. You probably know from even before this conference, that is to say about how what this idea of responsivity is, where it fits into the R&R paradigm, and then really take us through both what it means in terms of unpacking that. What are the considerations that we can bring to bear in thinking specifically about offenders with mental illness in particular, as we think about R&R and responsivity. With hopefully some practical, at least principles that we can take home, from this. In some sense, how we get here. I mean, what we're talking about is somewhat conceptual as opposed to directly practical. But frankly, from my perspective, and hopefully you'll agree, and this is where I love your feedback. Understanding the concept, in some ways changing the conceptual paradigm, I think can be helpful and ultimately have some very important practical considerations. So some of the ground is going to be somewhat familiar, but hopefully we'll contextualize this responsivity piece of it a little bit better, particularly for those of us working with offenders with mental illness. Let me see here, sorry. So just to quickly go through stuff that we all know very well, the overrepresentation of people with mental illness in the criminal justice system doesn't need to be brought home to this group at all. Obviously, the overlap is undeniable. Obviously, as I'm sure you've heard over the past couple of days, let alone in the past few years, the reasons for it perhaps are a little bit more nuanced, complicated than we originally thought in developing the criminalization hypothesis. And certainly, literature that's focused on people with serious mental illnesses, what we used to call axis 1 disorders, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, with delusions, hallucinations, and the question being, do those disorders and those kinds of symptoms predict, if you will, mental illness? Are those criminogenic factors? And that when you begin to expand the definition of mental illness to include things like impulsivity, impaired response inhibition, emotional reactivity, things that begin to bleed into personality disorders, that we're not even talking about substance use, obviously the criminogenic relationship begins to also expand, right? And so to be clear, when we say, and I think validly say, that people with mental illness are not a greater risk for recidivism, or that it's not a criminogenic factor, what we're really talking about there are the serious mental illnesses. Again, I said that what we used to call the axis 1 illnesses, the schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, the ones where there's significant dysfunction, often multiple hospitalizations and the like associated with it, essentially. So it's important to be clear about that, because, like I said, as you expand beyond that, then the relationship with recurrent criminality obviously increases. Criminogenic factors, and hopefully at the end of my talk we'll have expanded that idea of criminogenic in a sense, and that responsivity in a classic sense means maximizing the efficacy of the interventions designed to address the so-called criminogenic factors. Again, that's what I hope to unpack and maybe sort of change the concept a little bit for those of us who are here in the room today. And the way that's been sort of classically applied, in a sense, in part, right, is that that the risk phenomenon, looking at risk differently or more specifically, has been useful in thinking about people with mental illness in the criminal justice system, because we've been concerned that mental illness has been mistakenly thought of as a criminogenic factor, seen as higher risk folks from a recidivism perspective, and therefore perhaps remanded more frequently, held longer in jails and prisons because of a mistaken notion of a relationship between serious mental illness and recidivism. The needs concept has added to our work with offenders with mental illness by recognizing the fact that, number one, serious mental illness is not in and of itself a criminogenic factor, at least with respect to the active symptoms, and that if we don't attend to the other more so-called criminogenic needs, they will not have addressed the recidivism issues in our offenders with mental illness. And then finally, responsivity applies to the offenders with mental illness from the perspective of the ways in which mental illness may in and of itself interfere with attention to the criminogenic factors. Obviously, somebody who is too psychotic, too delusional, too thought disordered to participate in necessary cognitive behavior treatment is not going to have that treatment be, effective for them. Responsivity then, as you begin to drill down and open up this idea of responsivity. Responsivity itself has been divided in a classic sense into the general and specific. General being that we want to make sure that whatever we create for interventions to help address recidivism is responsive to the learning styles of that individual. The use of cognitive behavior treatment, things like thinking for a change, reasoning and rehabilitation, moral recognition therapy, interactive journaling, all those CBT-based interventions were based in part in themselves on R&R theory and the responsivity idea that is the kind of modality to which our offenders, including offenders with mental illness, can be most responsive. And then specific responsivity, which is where we're really going to begin to drill down over the next next half an hour or so, is the idea that in engaging, in working with an individual, with an offender, we have to also be responsive to their specific backgrounds, social, biological, cultural, etc. And that's what we want to look at with respect to mental illness, more specifically. The responsivity factors also have been called sort of the other stuff, right? The non-criminogenic, and I'm going to suggest that I think that's a misnomer. I think when we make this categorical distinction between criminogenic and non-criminogenic, I think we're missing the boat, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But as you can see, I think indirectly criminogenic may be a more accurate term for this other stuff. And as you can see here, it's a laundry list of things because we are all individuals. Our offenders are all individuals with unique backgrounds. backgrounds, and unique coping strategies, unique experiences, early and late experiences, and so that you can have, the laundry list includes from psychosis to gender to trauma to literacy to housing issues, etc., and you can add to this list. And indeed, responsivity to a certain extent has become this, if you will, repository of anything that didn't fit into the central 8, essentially. And part of what we want to try to do today is to kind of drill down to see really what about particularly people with mental illness affects their ability to both attend to the criminogenic factors, but may also be indirectly criminogenic in and of itself. Because again, what this doesn't address, for example, for people with mental illness, number one is the small number of people with mental illness who do offend because of their symptoms of serious mental illness. That's not addressed here as indirectly criminogenic. That's directly criminogenic, if you will. And it also doesn't pick up here the studies out of the women's risk needs assessment group who found that mental illness, particularly depression, is a criminogenic factor for women, essentially, in their studies. And so again, it's to drop it into, if you will, what can be almost a wastebasket of factors that are not criminogenic, probably isn't fair to it. And what's more, there was a study actually at a federal probation where they looked at individuals with moderate or high risk scores for recidivism, compared them to people with low risk for recidivism, and among the differentiating factors between who was at higher risk for recidivism and who was lower risk for recidivism were how many responsivity issues you had. So for all those reasons, it seems to me that it's unfair to say that responsivity factors are not criminogenic. Maybe they're indirectly criminogenic, and we have to understand how they affect somebody's risk for recidivism. But when we make this categorical differentiation, I think we don't do justice to these particular needs, if you will. So essentially what I'm trying to do here, right, is to kind of raise the profile of these responsivity factors, responsivity needs, that they're indeed not second-class citizens per se, but in fact they're perhaps differently criminogenic, but nonetheless we need to pay much more attention to them, not treat them as sort of the bastard child of R&R in a sense. And obviously from that laundry list we could apply this algorithm of unpacking specific responsivity and its relationship to recidivism to any one of those factors: trauma, housing, etc. We're going to focus large today really on mentally ill as certainly our first pass at this. And I guess one of the ways I'm going to get at this with you is the following, right? That it's not that mental illness itself is not criminogenic, right? It's that indeed mental illness, interventions for mental illness may not be enough to address recidivism, in particular because it's not just the symptoms of mental illness, but rather, if we see mental illness a little bit larger, that people with serious mental illness have particular both central 8 factors and particular social factors that lead them to be at greater risk for recidivism, we can see that there's a relationship between mental illness and recidivism that R&R in the classic sense doesn't give voice to. It doesn't give us a place to put, essentially. So we want to understand that a little bit better. And so with that in mind, I kind of want to, with that background, I want to kind of reboot and restart where we're at and kind of look at this with you from the perspective of what does the literature in and of itself specifically say about mental illness and recidivism, not what does the R&R literature say, but in people, particularly from the public psychiatry and public mental health sector, who've looked at mental illness, looked at recidivism, what does their data show as to what predicts recidivism? Then we'll look at how much of that actually tracks to central 8 factors, but also perhaps what is left out, what is not on central 8 that indeed the recidivism literature in mental illness speaks to. First, a little bit of prevalence issue, some prevalence data. The data is pretty clear, though not 100% in the same direction, that offenders with mental illness reoffend more frequently, reoffend more quickly, right? Some of the challenges to the literature I suggest to you, without drilling down too far here, is that some of the recidivism-related data on people with mental illness is based on looking at how many times they've been arrested as opposed to prediction of whether they're going to be rearrested. So that offenders with mental illness have more arrests as part of their history, suggesting that they're at greater risk for recidivism than offenders without mental illness. So it's not quite a predictive study as much as it is a prevalent study. And similarly, the studies around offenders and mental illness typically are variable in what their outcome is, because as you know, there's a difference between rearrest and reconviction, and both of those things and technical violations, all of which can land you back in prison or land you back in jail, but may actually be different from one another, and certainly are different when you're talking about new victims and new arrests, which is our greatest concern. Technical violations are a problem, but less of a problem in a sense than a new arrest where there's a new victim and a new crime. In terms of just the data, just to kind of give you a little bit more information here, right, so that when we say they're arrested more frequently, it's incremental, not categorical. So you're talking about percentages differences, so that in some studies, for example, the difference between an offender with the rate of the people who are rearrested with mental illness are like 75% versus 64% if they didn't have a mental illness. Or it's different between 64% offenders with mental illness getting rearrested in a year, or 60% of those without. So again, there is a statistically significant greater risk for recidivism among the offenders with mental illness, but it's not 100 and 0 or even 70 and 20. It really is in the single digits kind of differences usually, maybe 10% difference, if you will. Give you visually this is a study out of Colorado, and the three towers here, I'm going to show you here, right, are on the left are people with so-called qualifying mental illnesses. The middle, the black group is non-qualifying mental illnesses, and then this is people without mental illness on the right in these three various towers, and that's the recidivism rate over the course of 1, 3, and 5 years. You can see that the offenders with the qualifying mental illnesses on the left, on this left tower on each of these three bars, right, is indeed higher than people with mental illness, but lower than people with the non-qualifying mental illnesses, which includes in this context, substance abuse and antisocial personality, etc. Right? Interestingly, again, the qualifying illnesses include the ones that we're most concerned about in terms of serious mental illness, but they also threw in PTSD in this group, as well as people with so-called cluster A personality disorders, which are the odd cluster, paranoid personality disorder, schizotypal personality, kind of in the schizophrenic spectrum of illness. So again, you can see that people with qualifying disorders are higher than those without, but it's not a huge difference, right? Just to be clear, there is contradictory data, right? In New York, there's a study that we did where we looked at prison reentry and found that the rate of reentry among our offenders with mental illness wasn't different from offenders without mental illness. Here's a study that came out of Philadelphia, actually, about 10 years ago, in which on the left group here, this red bar, are the offenders with mental illness, right? And they're the lowest. In fact, they have a lower rate of recidivism than others. So this is not, the data isn't all in one direction, but what's most telling, I think, which begins to trade us into the responsivity areas that we'll be talking about in more detail in a couple of minutes, is the highest bar. And what do you think that is? Co-occurring substance abuse, not plain substance abuse, but mental illness and substance abuse. So the highest recidivism group are higher than mental illness and higher than substance abuse are the people who had both. So the co-occurring disorder group, and we'll see this again and again, is going to be a critical issue for us in terms of thinking about the risk of recidivism among offenders with mental illness. So moving from prevalence to risk factors. So the risk factors that have been reported in the literature looking at mental illness and recidivism, right, have included the following four big ones. Five, sorry. Substance abuse, family support or lack thereof, antisocial or prosocial peers, antisocial cognitions or personality, and housing or homelessness. These are the ones that consistently show up in the mental illness literature looking at recidivism of individuals with serious mental illness. In my scientific study using a word cloud, basically I took the literature search that we did looking at mental illness recidivism and just did a word count and created this word cloud. And just what was telling to me out of this was indeed among the biggest words on this list is substance use. Substance abuse, it showed up again and again, essentially, and we'll look at that in a moment. But the risks attendant upon recidivism for substance abuse in some ways dwarf almost everything else, essentially, and much else tracks back to that. I mean, there is issues of family support and lack thereof predicting recidivism among seriously mentally ill. There are housing issues. Vocational has been reported, particularly with respect to violent recidivism, but substance abuse comes up again and again and again and again. So let's look back at the Central 8 for a moment, and really crosswalk what we just looked at in terms of mental illness and recidivism with the Central 8 factors, and look at that in a little bit more detail. Because one of the ways I want to suggest that responsivity can be approached in thinking about people with mental illness and their risk for recidivism is to look at not whether or not it in of itself is a risk factor, but among these established criminogenic risk factors, which are the most important for the seriously mentally ill. This is just the usual table, but the table that might be relevant to the seriously mentally ill may be differently prioritized, if you will. So I've highlighted here the ones that we just talked about in terms of the mental illness and recidivism literature, right? And again, the most important one here, I think, among all of them really is substance abuse. There are higher rates of substance abuse among offenders with mental illness. 3/4 of people with mental illness in incarceration have substance abuse. That's higher than offenders without substance abuse. They have higher rates of recidivism. Indeed, one of the mechanisms for that could be, in part, that there are studies that show that people with substance abuse and mental illness are more likely to become medication non-compliant, and if that then trades them into behaviors or states in which they're more likely to be arrested, that creates a recidivism factor in and of itself. The antisocial features, right, have a life of their own, but within mental illness, particularly if you're thinking about features that aren't just the purely criminal thinking, but include irritability, hostility, emotional reactivity, those are states that are associated with people with serious mental illness when they are unstable. So certainly, if not the cognition, and certainly the personality pattern, which is maybe an overlap with serious mental illness. Family support is an issue is among the greatest challenges for people with serious mental illness. Those who are arrested, it makes it even more challenging in terms of negotiating the kind of support people need to indeed get to avoid recidivism. And finally, the vocational, obviously, people with that is a general risk factor. It's obviously a risk factor for people with serious mental illness, but a much more challenging one, arguably, for people with serious mental illness, for whom, even without a criminal justice history, their rate of employment is abysmal. Then it could be maybe 25% of people with serious mental illness are competitively employed. Not that they can't be, but that the programs aren't there to kind of help them get there, essentially. And it's a very important responsivity criminogenic factor. So this is my reordered, right? So if this, if you will, is the usual list, this is how I would reorder it, if you will, for people with serious mental illness. So the one factor that actually is not on the central 8 factors, but does show up recurrently in the literature on mental illness and recidivism, is homelessness, is housing. Probably among those of us who work with in diversion programs, reentry programs, probably the biggest bear that we have to kind of overcome, essentially, in trying to get services, is really addressing this problem of housing. It's a particular problem of people who are seriously mentally ill and justice involved. Whether housing itself or a lack thereof is itself a risk factor, in a direct sense, is obviously a question, right? There are clearly overlapping factors or associated features of people who are homeless and seriously mentally ill that put them at greater risk for recidivism. All of the factors that I've listed below here are indeed in the literature on mental illness and homelessness that are associated features. Substance abuse, lack of support in the community, lack of jobs, victimization. All of these things are outside of the justice world are associated with housing problems in the seriously mentally ill. Of course, they're also associated with recurrent criminality. So it makes perfect sense that housing issues put somebody at much greater risk for recidivism as opposed to those without, essentially, who actually are housed. Let me do one time. Oh, fine. So just circling back for a moment then. The classic version of responsivity would suggest the following: that for people with mental illness, in order to address their responsivity factors, what you have to do is address their active symptoms of serious mental illness such that they can attend to and take a part in the kind of interventions people need to address their criminogenic factors. You have to be able to deliver the material in a way that is commensurate with their cognitive abilities, even at baseline. And we want to be able to engage them adequately and know how to engage somebody who has a serious mental illness, because of course, unless they're engaged with you, they're not going to take advantage of the needs. That's the kind of the classic version. And the classic version itself would suggest that there are typical interventions that one can bring to bear for people with serious mental illness to address their criminogenic factors. For whether it's dialectical behavior therapy to address the kind of impulsivity and irritability and hostility that goes along with the antisocial personality pattern, typical cognitive behavioral treatments for criminal thinking, peer support, multifamily groups for families to enhance family support, supported employment. These are all, many of these, if not all of them, are evidence-based practices on the SAMHSA website that you can find and download and begin to bring to bear to address the criminogenic, in the classic sense, the criminogenic needs of our individuals with mental illness. And the responsivity factors would suggest that you really need to be able to make sure that you're delivering it in a way that a person with serious mental illness can take advantage of. But I want to kind of add to that, though, and this is where I'm going to kind of change the context here a bit. What I'm going to suggest is that we can think about responsivity in a slightly different way. And that is to say that there are some principles of responsivity and ways of thinking about risk for recidivism for people with serious mental illness. And I would argue this applies to other subgroups as well, but we'll start with serious mental illness. That can help us think about what puts someone at greater risk for recidivism, and not in a direct central 8 kind of responsivity kind of way. And the two ways I want to kind of talk to you about that, having set this up, right, is that we can look at the risk assessment piece of R&R in a responsivity kind of way. Thank you. And we can also then look at how we prioritize the needs that people have in a responsive way that's responsive to their mental illness. So let's just look at this, what I mean by responsivity-focused risk assessment first. There are 2 reasons that we do this structured risk assessment, usually, right? One of which is to decide, should somebody be in a program or not, right? Are they high risk enough, low risk, et cetera, right? We look at their risk level, right? And then we also use it for treatment planning purposes in terms of both level of supervision and types of, intervention, if you will. So that we look at to predict things like failure to appear, recidivism, et cetera. But we also look at it to look at what kind of treatment they need, what are their needs essentially, whether we're talking about the LSI or the COMPAS, and we'll talk about that in just a bit, in a moment. But in some ways, they're different audiences for the same issues, right? So that we want to look at inclusion is where we really want to make sure that people aren't overvaluing mental illness in the context of their criminogenic risk, if you will. So we're looking at structured risk assessment to ensure that in thinking about whether someone's likely to appear, likely to get in trouble in the community, that we're not overvaluing mental illness, On the other hand, for treatment planning purposes, we want to make sure that our assessments are able to identify the risks that are associated with mental illness that need to be accommodated in order to minimize recidivism. So it's, again, talking out of both sides of our mouths, but partly because we're talking at two different audiences, two different purposes. In terms of then, what about the needs prioritization? If we have included someone in, how do we apply this to needs prioritization? And I think there are a couple of things I want to kind of emphasize here. One of which is, well, we're going to circle back to the individualized pathway in a moment. I apologize for being a little out of order here. But what I want to suggest is, number one, is that I think we get in trouble when we start differentiating this criminogenic versus non. And this is probably different from what you've heard at every other session in this conference. You'll hear again. And I don't mean to suggest that there aren't things in Essential 8 that are specifically related to recidivism. The literature is very clear about that. But again, I don't want to undervalue things that are not directly related to recidivism, but then do trade through the Essential 8 perhaps into recidivism. So it's unfair to say, for example, I would suggest that a housing problem isn't a recidivism issue. It is a recidivism issue. It is a risk factor, albeit people can be not homeless and not commit crimes. Nonetheless, it is a recidivism factor for particular subpopulations. So we have to think a little bit larger about what is leading someone to be more likely to end up in jail or not, essentially. And we need to think about mental illness in the context of not just whether or not there's symptoms of serious mental illness, that is to say their delusions, their hallucinations, etc., are predicting their likelihood of rearrest, but rather whether or not there are associated social dysfunction that does indeed lead them to be more likely to be rearrested. So in helping our patient, our offender with mental illness, we need to think about them in a larger sense, that we're helping their recidivism if we're addressing the larger parts of their lives, and their mental illness in and of itself is an indirect risk factor for recidivism, if not a direct risk factor. So indeed, what I think the language I'd like to perhaps leave you with a part around this is to not criminogenic or not, but direct or not, essentially. And Essential 8 may be directly criminogenic, but a studied responsivity factor like mental illness is at very least indirectly criminogenic in a sense, and you need to think about it in that way in order to prioritize, for recidivism purposes, the treatment necessary. So one of the principles then is individualizing treatment. It's a principle of good mental health treatment, good recovery-focused treatment, and I would argue to you it's a principle also for recidivism-focused intervention for offenders. It's not something that certainly I made up. It's in the literature in a variety of different ways. This comes from a Scheme article in 2014. And what we're looking at here, just to be clear, is a notion that, look here, right? That, again, this idea of direct versus indirect, she's calling it direct versus fully mediated, that indeed their untreated mental illness may be directly related to criminal behavior in a very small number of people. The very small number of individuals whose voices or the delusions are leading to criminal behavior. More frequently, it's a mediated relationship. That is to say, something about their mental illness is related to either one of the Essential 8 risk factors or a third variable like homelessness that is driving criminal behavior, essentially. And the question I think I want to take us to now is, how do we operationalize that middle box there, that third variable, that general, how do we operationalize that for ourselves? And I would suggest that a pathways approach is a way to think about it. And that is to say that our offenders, that in the aggregate we can talk about risk factors, but what we want to kind of work toward, I would suggest, is something along the lines of an individualized understanding for our offenders of how that person's various risk factors, both in the Essential 8 or not in the Essential 8, responsivity or needs, how those come together to lead them to be a greater risk, more likely to end up being rearrested. So the context where housing instability, along with mental illness and substance abuse, leads someone to have no support in the community for pro-social behavior, they fall into the wrong crowd, they're getting rearrested. Oops, did I change? No. You could change that around, and where the housing instability and the mental illness put them at greater risk for substance use, and the substance use is what then is associated for that individual with the criminal recidivism. Or finally, you could have somebody whose mental illness is what drives them into the system, essentially, in a more direct sense, but tracks back to the fact that they were in an unstable housing situation in which they couldn't get good access to mental health care. They were more unstable, and indeed they picked up drugs that were thrown out of their house by their parents. They're more likely to be arrested, essentially. And the point here being that we can individualize the treatment planning for our offenders, for our clients, in a way that addresses their particular recidivism. A model for that to think about as an analogy is what we're doing was the state-of-the-art in violence risk assessment. The state-of-the-art tool for that it's called the HCR20. It's a 20-item checklist, if you will, of factors associated with violent behavior in individuals with mental illness. The way that one is trained to use that is the following. Not as a checklist that then ends up, the more risk factors you have, the higher your risk is, or some risk score that puts you at a certain number, a certain percentage likelihood of being rearrested, but rather that in going through this checklist, it's called structured risk assessment, structured professional judgment, going through this checklist, going through these factors, one then develops for your patient, for your client, an individualized risk scenario or scenarios. What are the scenarios in which this person is more likely to be rearrested, or in the context of HCR20, more likely to become violent? And it is those scenarios that ultimately drive the intervention, the supervision, the structure, and the types of interventions that you bring to bear, essentially. So similarly here, what I'm suggesting is that we look at our R&R model and operationalize the responsivity factor as a way of individualizing our treatment plans for our offenders, such that we take into account both the central aid factors and the responsivity factors associated with recidivism without giving one a hierarchy over the other, essentially, but understand them contextually in the context of that person, that offender's risk for recidivism, and then drive the treatment and the supervision in that direction. And so this pathways approach allows us to do that in a more nuanced and, I think, responsive way for offenders with mental illness. There are some tools out there that begin to do this, not in a totally structured ways, but just to give you some sense of what's out there already. So, for example, the LSCMI, the level of symptom inventory, level of service inventory, case manager version, in a sense, right? That actually does, the scoring of it is actually specifically risk and needs. But they ask a series of responsivity questions that are designed to help raise awareness of other issues that someone might need to attend to. It's not structured in the same way I'm discussing in terms of individualizing the scenario, but it does raise those issues. Somewhat similarly, there's the tool that I'm a little bit more familiar with, the Compass, which is also a national use as well, but used in New York State, particularly through the probation, the state probation and state parole, kicks out not 8 factors, but 20. Right? So 8 of the 20 are what you'd expect from the central 8, but the other 12 involve various things from social isolation to housing to family to, if you will, non-central 8 factors. So begin to try to raise awareness about other things. Again, it doesn't take you back to a scenario kind of or pathways approach, but again, what's useful about both the LSCMI and the Compass in this regard is that it doesn't overvalue central aid versus responsivity or vice versa, essentially. It suggests that we need to figure out for each individual client what from among those factors really are going to be most relevant. And perhaps this is the most relevant, frankly, because what is sadly interesting and tragic, right, that the social determinants of serious mental illness, of health generally, and of criminality are very, very similar. That we're largely talking about people who are living in communities with fewer social services, more criminality, more antisocial people walking around, antisocial peers, more substance use, where there's decreased educational attainment, more challenges with employment, all factors associated with recidivism in a direct sense, and so that And that with respect to mental illness, it's a situation in which the literature suggests both there are ways in which communities like this, adverse childhood experiences, and community economic stress both exacerbates mental illness, particularly depression, but also can be the result of someone who has a serious mental illness, probably more like people with schizophrenia, where there's a bit of a, what we used to call downward drift, now it's social selection, but where they've lost a foothold in at least lower middle class and end up in the communities where there's more criminality, more substance abuse, more risk factors essentially. And so part of the good news, bad news here is that we have to really attend to the social issues that we're all concerned about for our individual offenders, and our programs generally are terribly important because they really do predict everything. What's a little challenging, I think, for the literature to address, and certainly it hasn't done so far, is what the causal arrows are. Whether the community leads to the mental illness, leads to substance abuse, or vice versa. Does the criminality then lead to homelessness and exacerbate substance abuse, or vice versa? Not really clear, but I would argue for those of us working tomorrow or next Monday back at the front lines, kind of doesn't matter. Once I got a guy in front of me who's homeless, using drugs, getting out of jail, just got out of jail, may go to, they're all intertwined. I got to unpack them and kind of address them all if they're all relevant to that person's risk for recidivism, essentially. So I think part of this, my suggestion here is really twofold. One of which is that our advocacy around addressing as early as possible, frankly, the social issues that are attended upon criminality, serious mental illness, drug use, and health generally is critical. And I would encourage us to continue to kind of push on those issues. For our individual offenders with mental illness to think about their mental illness as driving recidivism with respect to the economic and social stresses that they're under is an important part of the work that we do with our offenders with mental illness, and perhaps among the most important recidivism-focused interventions that we can bring to bear for them. And there is some good news on the horizon, and I at least can speak from the New York State perspective, right? So that among the changes that have followed the Affordable Care Act, certainly in New York, has been a focus for health and mental health on so-called community-based services, which include things like transportation, include just general transportation, right? Include things like vocation, include things that either are responsivity-focused or, in fact, essential aid-focused in a way that aren't directly related to health or mental health in the traditional sense of the word. So, at least in New York, and this is a grand experiment, and it's about to kick off January 1st, we're beginning to fund responsivity factors for health and mental health purposes, not for recidivism necessarily, but I think we in the criminal justice world will benefit from that eventually. So kind of in summary here, what am I suggesting? I'm suggesting the following, that treatment of mental illness is critical, and critical for addressing recidivism, because it in fact may address, secondarily perhaps, the social determinants that are indeed associated with recidivism, and that addressing these social determinants is what is necessary ultimately to drive down the recidivism that we're looking for. One other way of looking at this second to last slide here, right, is that we can look at this sort of an individual approach versus systems approach. Specific responsivity versus a concept that you may read about called system responsivity, essentially. So at the specific responsivity level, looking with our individual offender, we want to think about mental illness writ large, including the social issues that are associated with mental illness and recidivism, and address those as part of why we want to address mental illness and recidivism. And at the systems level, we want to make sure the system is able to actually help us address these social determinants, because if it doesn't, then we're back at square one anyway. One final way to put it, is indeed quoting Jen Scheme from a recent article where she was looking at the limits of R&R for offenders with mental illness, at least the limits of the literature to date and the research to date. And she said the following, which I think is really what I want to leave you with, and that is that when clinical factors potentiate general risk factors, they become part of the criminogenic story. And the two things I want to leave you with from this slide are the idea that criminogenic does include responsivity factors and aren't really separable from that. And the second thing I want to leave you with from Jennifer's quote is the idea of story. That if we really want to individualize and from a responsivity focus, address our offenders' risk for recidivism on an individualized basis, what we really want to come to is their story. What is the story that puts them at greater risk for recidivism? The better we can unpack that story for our individual offenders, the better we can help them decrease their recidivism. I'm going to stop there. Thank you. Good. So I appreciate this. Like I said, this is my first pass at this particular talk, so I apologize if it's a little bit jumpy. But I really would be delighted if anybody has any concerns, comments, questions. It's a big room. It's hard. There are a couple of microphones here. Anybody want to disagree? Yes, if you have a question, I see you have to come to the microphone, please. And
so in responding to the responsivity, sometimes we're at a disadvantage where we're identifying where some of the needs are, but we're limited on resources. So I've almost adopted a different approach, which is looking at the protective factors and trying to build upon those as a strategy, because sometimes we're against the inevitable, which is, again, the lack of resources. And we identify the need, but we don't really necessarily have the tools in place or the full gamut of tools that would actually respond to all the risk factors. And secondly, the other point that I have is, we emphasize through this conference about, the criminal justice system at large really understanding mental illness co-occurring. But I wonder, is that discussion also at the clinical side where education institutions are considering understanding the criminogenic factors that the client base that they're serving, and how can they incorporate the treatments into their practices?
Right. So I appreciate the comment about protective factors. It's certainly not something that I focused on today, and I probably should think about how to include some of those issues there. Right. Like I said, the broad story, to take Jen's word here, the broad story here is to recognize responsivity issues, protective and otherwise, as part of the criminogenic story, essentially, and not separate from, which I think is where some of the conversation happens when we're really focused on central aid versus not central aid, essentially. As to your second point, I think that's in part a lot of what the Council of State Government does through training. Indeed, and I can speak in New York, for example, we created an Academy for Justice-Informed Practice designed specifically to encourage providers of general mental health and substance abuse services, but particularly mental health services, to learn about the justice system and justice needs and criminogenic need, and try to really drive some of these evidence-based practices into those systems, essentially. So it's happening. It needs to happen more, but that's indeed part of the challenge, is try to get, and I guess, I don't know, again, in a national sense, certainly in New York, I can say that part of the challenge of driving some of these additional or perhaps more specific criminogenic or central aid focused interventions, like the cognitive behavioral treatment law, frankly, has been that the whole health and mental health care world is changing so rapidly that many of the clinics that we work with are just trying to stay afloat. They're trying to figure out how they're going to have the doors open next year, essentially, or what it's going to look like, and what they're going to get paid for, and what managed care is going to pay for, et cetera. And so this criminal justice thing is a little bit, is almost a bridge too far for the moment. One of the hopes finally, though, is that at least part of the conversation in New York at a policy level actually is, how do we make recidivism a health outcome? How can we include that so that a managed care company, for example, is going to care about whether someone ends up back in jail. So see, when a person goes back to jail, it goes back, and they don't fall off the suddenly that's not 5 weeks off the Medicaid rolls, nothing to pay for, but in fact somehow that becomes a metric for positive treatment outcome that a provider has to care about and a payer has to care about. And so we're kind of trying to work that in there, because if we can make that part of what they have to care about from a bottom line perspective, that will hopefully in and of itself drive them to do the best practices to avoid the recidivism. Whereas now, certainly historically, if someone goes to jail, at worst it's neutral, and at best, they're off my payroll for my payroll for a couple of weeks. That's a good thing. We're changing that hopefully, and that'll be helpful, I think, as well. Yes, in the back.
Hi. First, thank you so much. I've been kind of wondering about how this robust R&R literature really applies to our mental illness population. And this is kind of one of the first times I've heard kind of brought together a theory about this. So thank you. I have two questions. One's very concrete about whether you've published anything on this kind of pathways model. And then the second about how to best look at these social determinants, these mediating factors you're talking about in developing these more individualized sort of risk conceptualizations, for lack of a better way to put that, so that we're not kind of going back to the unstructured clinical judgment sort of way of looking at cases, and we can do it thoughtfully and in an evidence-based sort of way.
So I'll say a couple, well, thank you for that. I'll say we actually, Dr. Osher and I are actually working on a publication that hopefully this is kind of the first shot across the bow of, essentially. So hopefully within the next 6 to 12 months, we'll have something out there that'll capture some of this, for everybody. That's kind of really one of our major goals. As to how to do this in a structured way, it's certainly this balance between individualization and aggregate and structured that based on aggregate data is a challenging one always. I guess my suggestion would be, given what the state of the art is right now and the literature is right now, that if one uses things like, for example, the compass or the LSCMI, where there is a structured way in which you're making sure you're asking all the right questions, right? That at least allows you to, number one, make sure that you're attending to the central 8 factors that may get ignored potentially in people with more serious mental illness, but that you're also picking up on the social determinant issues. And again, like I said, the LSCMI and the compass, neither of them really help you kind of order them for your individual patient. Compass a little bit better, I think, than this LSCMI probably. But that said, at the very least, make sure that you're asking all the right questions. And then ultimately it's applying that to the individual that becomes, if you will, less structured. We're just beginning this. There's an article, as I alluded to, Jennifer Scheme just wrote an article literally about 6 months ago, one of the major writers in this area, where she really says we're just thinking about this, that we've appropriately looked to R&R to help us think about recidivism in our offenders with mental illness, but the literature is really new. So we're kind of just beginning to figure this out and think this through. So hopefully in a couple of years we'll have more specific information. Right now, I would argue that we want to make sure we're asking the right questions, and there are some structured instruments to do that, but that we're thinking about we're structuring the prioritization of those needs, whether they're central 8 or responsivity. We're structuring them based on the individual's story as opposed to just what the score comes out as. And I think I'm at 0. Okay, thank you very much. I really appreciate your comments, and enjoy the afternoon.